Good afternoon and welcome to this Academies Update webinar. My name is Mike Farwell. I'm a partner at James Cooper Preston, head of our charities and education team. We work with lots of academies. This is the latest in a series of webinars. This one's on the topic of value for money, tendering tips and collaborative procurement. And we've got a good number of people on the webinar, a mix of governors and school business managers and various others. We're aiming to run the session for up to 45 minutes. We've got a question session at the end. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by Lorraine Ashover of Minerva Procurement Consultancy Services. I've known Lorraine for many years. In fact, I think when she set her business up, I was the one who referred her very first client to her. So Lorraine's been working in the education sector for a long time, specialising in value for money issues. Lorraine works with many of our clients, schools and academies, helping them achieve value for money. So I'm sure you'll find she'll have lots of interesting ideas for you. In terms of the structure for the session, we'll start with an introduction. We'll cover value for money statements and accounts. Lorraine will tell us a bit about Minerva. We'll cover money saving tips. We'll cover changes in OJU documentation, the official journal of the European Union. Lorraine will explain more about that shortly. We'll talk about how you can achieve better value for money through collaboration, and we'll close with some questions. So in terms of the introduction, there are many different definitions of value for money, but I think quite a good one is achieving the best education for children in relation to the budget spent at your school. In terms of a few sort of related issues, many of you, I think, would have seen our annual benchmarking survey, the Questionnaire Academy's benchmark report, which details lots of data about individual academies. You can choose your academy, compare it with others, ask questions such as why is our light and heat so much more than other academies, or why is our staff cost as a percentage of income so different to others. So it flags up lots of useful questions. We'll talk quite a bit about procurement and collaboration, which have been big issues in recent years. Clearly, I think it will probably be obvious that this is a key role for school business managers, making sure that resources are deployed effectively. And it's lots of useful resources on the ESFA website and the National Association of School Business Management websites. And it goes, I think, without saying that the ESFA, I keep struggling not to just call it the EFA, are very keen on schools achieving value for money in these sort of difficult times from a financing perspective. In terms of annual reporting in your accounts, the value for money statements covered in the accounts direction, which I'm sure school business managers will be familiar with. This is included in the narrative governance statement towards the beginning of your accounts. Of course, it's the accounting officer, usually your head teacher's responsibility. So this is a requirement where you can demonstrate to parents and the public how you've achieved value for money and the efficient use of public money. Important in there to consider a focus for improvement, and I think in the world in which we live in today, I think continuous improvement is important. So there are two major elements to the value for money. One is a standard declaration, which is essentially the accounting officer acknowledging that this area is their responsibility. But the second, and I think perhaps the more interesting one, is the requirement to give a few examples of how you are achieving value for money. They don't need to be long examples. I think you're encouraged to be concise. And the suggestion is that three examples is usually sufficient, detailing what you've achieved in the value for money area. So this is something that you do need to report on externally. The value for money can include income as well as expenditure. I think more naturally this area sits with expenditure, but income generation is a way of achieving value for money. And the areas, for example, collaboration, benchmarking, or improved procurement procedures are other ways in which you can achieve value for money. So I think this is a great point for me to hand over to Lorraine to cover some of the key themes we're looking at today. Lorraine.
Thank you very much, Mike. That's great. So I'll just start off with a little amusing cartoon which I came across, which I think probably very much reflects what goes on in quite a number of sort of governor meetings and senior leadership team meetings. Don't think we're ready as a team to make the necessary savings yet, so can I suggest that we focus on wasting money more efficiently? Sadly, I think that is familiar in a lot of places, and part of our work at Minerva is to actually try to avoid that happening. Just a very brief slide there about Minerva. I don't intend to go through all of the points on there because you can obviously read them at your leisure, but really just it's there to give you some idea of our credentials really in terms of why I'm qualified to speak to you today on this particular topic. Minerva is 7 years old as an organisation, and we only work with schools, so we're very focused on the issues that you face. Prior to that, I had a career in Barclays, and again, the latter years of that were focused on the finances for schools, colleges and universities. So I've got lots of in-depth knowledge about the sector, and in particular, obviously, looking at cost savings and trying to ensure, as Mike said, that we achieve this value for money, which everybody is looking for. So just moving on to some tips really for saving money. So tip number one is make sure that you have a really robust specification of what you want. This is absolutely critical because we quite often hear schools say that, well, we didn't get what we asked for, but when you actually look at what they asked for in their specification, they have actually, the supplier has delivered exactly what they've asked. It's just that the specification didn't really reflect what the school required. So it's very important to make sure that when you're writing up your specification that you really do consider everything that you need and make sure that it's included in there. Do speak to other people in your teams that are maybe using the supplies and services that you're tendering in order to ensure that you don't miss anything vital that they may require. The other tip that I put on there is always read the small print. You know, I recognise that going through maybe a 10-page contract with really small font is not something that anybody wants to do and probably doesn't really have time to do. However, if a matter ends up in court in any way, shape or form, or there's any kind of legal proceedings, a judge or solicitor will only look at what's in the contract document. They're not interested in what's in the TENS documentation. So we've seen this happen many times before where suppliers have promised the earth in a tender, the contract documents come out, and then a lot of what has been promised in the tender isn't actually reflected in the contract. Don't be frightened to go back to the supplier and say, I'm not happy to sign that contract on that basis. It doesn't reflect what we agreed and you need to change it. You know, despite the fact that a lot of them are standard contracts, it doesn't mean that they can't be changed. So, you know, don't be fearful to have that conversation with them. So the second tip I've got is with regard to contract registers. This is something that you know, is really easy to do, but a lot of people miss the opportunity. Something that we see on a very regular basis is schools paying really penal rates for some of the services that they're using, and often it's because they've just not made a note of the renewal date of the contract, and they've then rolled into sort of out of contract or deemed penal rates. The other issue with that is that often when a contract has rolled over, that it actually rolls over for quite a long period as well. So you've got a double whammy really, that you can't even then give notice because it's probably rolled over for at least another 12 months. So you don't want those sort of things happening. They're very expensive when they do, and also enormously frustrating. So have a contracts register, keep a note of the renewal date, but most importantly as well, keep a note of the termination periods, because some of these can be very long. They can range from anything from 30 days through to 6 months. And in fact, I'm aware of, I'm not going to name them, but there is an energy organisation who actually are doing 2-year energy contracts, and it's 2 years notice to exit the contract. So in other words, on the day that your contract starts, you have to give notice that you're interested in terminating. It's absolutely ridiculous, but that's what it is. So it's really important to make sure that you do note the renewal date and the termination periods. It does take a while to draw up a contracts register, but as a good friend of mine who was in the forces said, time spent in reconnaissance is seldom wasted. And I think if you can spend a day up front ensuring that you've got a note of those dates somewhere, it doesn't have to be anything particularly pretty, just a spreadsheet will do, but it will definitely stand you in good stead. So tip number 3, don't leave things too late. This is my favourite cartoon of all of them. For any of you that have been through an OG process, you'll know that that slide, that cartoon there is probably quite reflective of what an OG process looks like. We actually say to people, if you've got a contract that is running that is due to renew and you're going to breach the OG threshold, then you need to leave at least really 6 months to run the process from start to finish. For those of you who aren't aware, the overdue threshold is currently £164,176. If you have a contract that is valued at that figure, and that is the whole life value of the contract, so not the annual value, but the whole life value of the contract, then you've got to follow very strict European Union procurement directives. That's enforced in the UK through the Public Contracts Regulations 2015. It's got really strict timetable timescales. You must adhere to them. You've got to be compliant. So if you're running an overdue process, I would strongly recommend you allow at least 6 months for the process from start to finish. Even if it's a fairly simple contract renewal, I would still allow kind of at least 12 weeks because I'm sure that your own internal financial regulations probably state that you're going to need to get a minimum of 3 quotes. And you need to allow time for things like final negotiations, allowing time to read your terms and conditions, as we just talked about, implementing and mobilising your contract. And if the contract involves labour, as it says on my bonus tip there, then cleaning, catering, grounds maintenance, those types of contracts. You may also have 2P consultations that are required if your current supplier doesn't retain the contract. So you need to allow a minimum of 30 days for those 2P consultations as well. Basically allow lots of time. So tip number 4, this is an interesting one because targets isn't something really that schools are particularly familiar with. But having come from a corporate background, targets were something we were very used to. It is a way of driving better results from your procurement activities by setting yourself a target to reduce your cost by maybe perhaps a certain percentage. Not all of your contracts will renew during a particular academic year, so you need to assess the ones that are renewing, and importantly, I think assess the ones where you feel it's realistic to actually make some reductions in cost, because some of them it won't be. Cleaning again is a good example, or anything that involves labour. It's more difficult, it's more challenging to achieve cost savings in those areas because the vast majority of the cost is the people. And with national living wage, national minimum wage increasing, pension contributions increasing and so on, there will also be training, probably new equipment required for those types of contracts. It's unlikely but not impossible that you will make cost savings in those areas. So you need to sort of be realistic about what you think is achievable. For the other categories though, where you think there is a saving available, then set yourself a target. Because then when you're in that final negotiation with a supplier, it's amazing how it does focus your mind in those very last negotiations with them. If you think, oh, I haven't quite achieved what I needed to, I wanted to get 10% saving in that, I've only got 8, then it's a really good way of actually focusing your mind to push yourself to have that additional conversation. Because I know it's not easy, we do it all the time with negotiations, but it's definitely a skill. And some people are more familiar with it and more comfortable with it than others. The other thing I would say on that is to have something that we call a BAFO, which is a best and final offer. Quite often suppliers will, even when they've put their sort of final bids in, they'll have a little bit of room for manoeuvre with their pricing. So we usually say, go back to them and say, that's really great, I'm very keen to sign up with you, I like what I see, however, I do need a final offer, I need another, X%, or can you see what else you can do? For salespeople, the fact that you've said that you're interested in signing is great for them because they're definitely keen to get your signature on the contract. So they may very well eke a little bit more out of the deal for you in order to get you to sign on the dotted line. So, don't forget to go back and ask for that BAFO, best and final offer. You'll be amazed at how much extra you might achieve as a result. So my final tip, tip number 5, is don't be afraid to ask for help. There are loads of sources of support for procurement, so don't be afraid to seek it out. Most of it is free, and there's also no need to reinvent the wheel. Don't forget that many of your colleagues in other schools have probably been there, done it, and bought the t-shirt in terms of what it is you're looking to do. So do make sure that you are in contact with them. I know that the school business management community is extremely generous in terms of the sharing of information and documentation. So don't be frightened to ask your colleagues. Alongside your colleagues, there's lots of organisations that have got procurement advice. Mike mentioned a couple at the beginning, the ESFA, NASBN, the Department for Education website's got really good advice on it. There's things like the Key, the school bus, Crown Commercial Services. I mean, there's an absolute wealth of really useful information out there. And when it comes to tender documents, what you will find is that it's under the legislation, when you're running a tender, all the documentation for the tender must be made freely available to any interested parties. So what that means is, if you're wanting to procure, for example, an ICT managed service contract, something which is quite complex, you can go onto the OG website, do a search for those types of tenders, and it will bring up a whole raft of them, and then you'll be able to access the documents. So you're not, trying to get something that you shouldn't, or do it on the QT. It's all freely available. So do download some of that documentation, because that will give you some ideas of things that you can do. The only sort of caveat to that is try not to pick something that's maybe for the Department for Education, because you'll probably find it's 250 pages and not really relevant to what you need. Try and see if you can find some ones that are fairly similar to your own circumstances and schools, and then that way hopefully they'll be a useful source of information. The other place that people forget, which is an enormously helpful source of information, is the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. So that's the really the sort of the industry websites to go to, and they again have loads of useful information on there, lots of tender documents, lots of sample contracts, lots of training, that's all was mostly freely available. So that's another good source of information. There's also on there a very useful guide for suppliers. We tend to find that there are a lot of SME businesses who aren't used to completing OG tenders. It's not something that they have a department for, and therefore it can be very daunting for them to run through that type of process. So if you're running an OG process and the supplier that you have, or maybe a supplier you're interested in tendering, you think maybe they don't have that sort of experience, that guide is enormously helpful to them, because it talks them through what sort of information they're likely to be asked for and gives them some guidance. So that's a nice thing that you can do to help the suppliers along, and hopefully enable some businesses that you're interested in having tender to do so. Finally, obviously, there are organisations like our own. We run tenders every day, and what an exciting life we lead. We're always happy to provide advice. We've got lots of free resources on our website. I've popped a note on there. There's a contact form that you can go on our website and complete, and we'll give you a call if you've got a particular question or concern, but we've also got free resources which I'll mention later on as well. So do use all of that information. It can get a bit of information overload, but hopefully you'll manage to sort through the bits that you need. And if you do get stuck, then people like us, we're always on the end of the phone. You can always pick up the phone and give us a call and have a chat.
Okay, thanks very much, Lorraine. Time for a bit of audience participation. So we'll just be launching a poll in a second. Hopefully that will be appearing on your screen. How successful do you feel you are achieving value for money at your school? This is completely confidential, of course. It'd be great if you could vote, and we can see what the general state of play is. So if you can vote, I think a number of you have voted. There's a few more still to go. Okay, we'll close it in a few seconds. Great. Okay. Well, that's very interesting. Nobody said we haven't tried anything yet, which is great news. That everyone's hopefully got the value for money message. Just under 30% of people are saying that they believe they're very successful, which is good news. And around about 70% or so are saying that they've had some success but need to do more. So hopefully, if we were to run this webinar in a few months' time, that I think 29% is running at currently would increase a bit. So it's clear to see the message has got through. Most people recognising that they have had some success, but there's a bit more to do. So at that point, I'll hand back to Lorraine, who's going to talk about the wonders of OG and related matters. Lorraine.
Thank you. Yes, very exciting. Selection questionnaire. I'm not sure how many of you are aware. This does seem to have sort of gone under the radar for a lot of people. But as of last year, there was a new sort of selection questionnaire, a new set of documentation, new set of rules with regard to how you run an OG procurement. And as it says on the slides there, now all OG procurements must include this selection questionnaire stage. This is effectively replacing what was the old PQQ stage, so the pre-qualification stage. And this is the stage where you're shortlisting your suppliers for the second stage, which is the invitation to tender. It applies to all public sector procurements over the OG threshold, no exceptions, so you must be using it. If you're about to start a process and you're not aware of this, you need to get yourself up to speed with it really quickly. It's a very strict set of requirements for the questions that can be asked, which in most cases cannot be deviated from at all. There's an organisation which is part of Crown Commercial Services called the Mystery Shopper, which is a strange name because it doesn't really particularly reflect what they do. But if you want to change any element of the selection questionnaire questions, you must get permission from them to do so. So it's very strict in terms of what you can ask. The one thing that it doesn't apply to is what's called the light touch regime. And many of you will be aware of this. This is a different set of regulations which applies to a small number of spend categories that are being tendered. The one that's relevant for schools is catering. So school catering falls under this light touch regime, which has a much higher threshold for contract values, just shy of £590,000 on the contract value. So that's covered under the light touch regime, and you don't need to do the selection questionnaire for the light touch regime, but it is recommended so that you can ensure that you don't breach any rules and regulations. Where it mustn't be used, you mustn't use the selection questionnaire for anything that falls below the threshold. So request for proposal, sort of one-stage processes, you mustn't use it for that. But as it says on the slide, don't worry, that's why we're here. There's lots of advice and help out there, as I mentioned earlier, that we can cover. So why the change from the old PQQ process? Well, really it's designed to simplify the process of shortlisting suppliers. It's to make it easier for smaller businesses and SMEs to be shortlisted, as I alluded to earlier. It's now compliant with the European Single Procurement Document, which was issued last year. It's a more consistent approach to selection, and it removes the administrative burden on suppliers by introducing self-declaration status against some of the exclusion grounds. So with regard to the simpler process for shortlisting, the questions are much easier to understand, the scoring is much simpler, as most of the questions are either information only or pass-fail. The downside with this is that what it's meant is if you maybe get 15 companies tendering for your contract and the vast majority of questions, or all of the questions maybe, are pass-fail and all 15 of them pass, then that's your shortlist. 15, you're not actually shortlisted at all. So it has, in trying to simplify the process, it's actually added a new complexity, which is that it's quite hard to actually get your list down to a manageable number. However, there are 3 parts to the selection questionnaire. Parts 1 and 2, you're not able to actually change, but part 3, you are. And I'll come on to that in a moment, because that's where you can actually do a little bit of sort of changing of the questions in order to help you with your shortlist. It will be easier for small businesses, therefore, to tender, because a new set of questions is not required for every procurement opportunity. So each time they go in to maybe bid on an OG opportunity, they'll see the same questions. So it's much easier for them to manage and less time consuming. And also they can reuse existing forms to provide information as long as the information has remained relevant and correct. The other thing is about the consistency. All questions are now standardised, so there's less room for sort of ambiguous shortlisting. In other words, it's very much harder now to kind of cheat and make sure that you shortlist the people that you want to. It's designed to actually make it a level playing field, and along the lines, always with OG, of fairness and transparency. The self-declarations also make it easier for the suppliers to complete it. So evidence is only required from the winning bidder, and thus it reduces the administrative burden, not only on the suppliers but also on you, because you don't have to ask everybody to provide all the evidence of insurance and accreditations and so on. You only have to ask the winning bidder to provide that at the end. And the other thing is that where certificates are available, they can be accessed from a national database free of charge, so the suppliers are then not required to actually produce them either. So it's a much more simple, straightforward and simplified process. The other thing about the selection questionnaire is obviously that this is to actually measure a supplier's capability and capacity to perform the works and services. So it's not the specifics of how it will be achieved. That comes in the invitation to tender stage. So as mentioned earlier, the selection questionnaire is split into 3 sections. Part 1 and Part 2 are the ones that are basically, you can't change them. They're mandatory. Part 1 contains basic information about the suppliers, i.e. contact details, trade memberships, parent companies, that kind of thing. Part 2 is also mandatory. That covers your self-declarations against exclusions and gives the opportunity for things like the self-cleansing and so on. They're the questions around things like, have your directors done anything naughty? Is all your VAT and PAYE up to date, etc. Part 3 also contains self-declarations. That's around financial standing and technical capacity. You can't change anything in Part 1 or Part 2. These can be stored and reused. So again, from your perspective, it's great because if you run a one OG process for your catering, for example, or your cleaning, then you can use parts 1 and 2 again for grounds maintenance and again for ICT managed services. So those parts can stay exactly the same. Part 3 is the area where you can change a question to make it, but it has to be project specific. You can't include generic questions. So a good example of this would be something around environmental policies. So what you couldn't ask is, have you got an environmental policy? Or what is your environmental policy? Because that's generic. What you could ask though is, our school is extremely green and we're very conscious of the environment. We want to encourage the students to be green and therefore we would like to understand your environmental credentials in respect of this cleaning contract. That's okay to ask because that's project specific, it's school specific, so you are able to do that. However, what I would say is don't add dozens and dozens of questions in. You need to keep them fairly limited because otherwise you will fall foul of making too many changes. Part 3 can also be scored with a predefined weighting. All the other questions are not weighted. So again, Part 3 is the area, because there are weightings, where you can actually differentiate between the bidders, and actually that's where you can therefore shortlist a certain number of suppliers. So you could, in your documentation, say that maybe the top 7 bidders will be shortlisted, and then perhaps the top 3 bidders at the ITT stage will be invited to present to the school. So that's where you can start to make the process more manageable in terms of numbers, because as I'm sure you can appreciate, nobody probably wants 15 people coming around on a site visit for something, and you certainly don't want 15 bidders shortlisted for a presentation day, because that's probably going to take you 3 days to get through. And last time I checked, I don't think anybody wants to sit through 3 days of presentations about cleaning contracts and mops. So that's your way of actually shortlisting. So that's all the details about selection questionnaires. I hope that's been helpful.
Thanks very much, Lorraine. So time for a bit more audience participation. So we'll be running another poll on your screen. So before we move on to the section on collaboration, we're just running a poll on this. So has anyone had the opportunity to participate in any collaborative procurement exercises with other schools? Bit of a mouthful, but hopefully you get the general idea. Have you done any collaboration before? So we're giving you 3 options. One is yes, it was successful. 1, yes, it wasn't successful. And the other option is no, we haven't done any collaboration. So if I could ask you all to vote. The votes are beginning to come in. I'll give you a little bit longer. Bit longer. Well, that's very interesting, because more than 50% are saying that yes, they have done it and it was successful. Interesting, no one has said that it wasn't successful, which I think is good news. About 40% have said that they haven't participated in any collaboration. So hopefully for those of you who haven't participated, you'll see that well over 50% of the audience are saying that they have done it and it was successful. Nobody is saying it wasn't successful. So perhaps there's a general hint there that it might be worth considering some collaboration, which of course is now an ideal point for me to hand back to Lorraine, who's going to tell you a bit about collaboration. Lorraine.
Perfect, that's brilliant. I'm really pleased to see that for those people that have participated in some collaboration, that it's been a success. That's really great news. We do a lot of collaborative procurement exercises, and I have to say they're fantastic, and they are successful, so they're well worth getting involved in. So collaborative purchasing, what is it? Well, obviously it's when two or more groups of people or organisations engaged in procurement work together for mutual benefits. And it's fair to say that it doesn't come without challenges. Someone needs to stick their head above the parapet and administer the process. And obviously with everyone being as busy as you are, it's understandably people don't want to stick their hand up and say, well, I'll organise it all, because there's could potentially be a massive amount of work involved in it. And it may also add an additional layer to the process when you've got somebody who's acting as a sort of conduit for it. Another challenge that we quite often hear people talk about is that maybe the overall group objectives are different to those of some of the individual members of the group. That does happen, but in the vast majority of cases there is a huge amount of similarities between actually what schools require. And if you pick the right spend categories to run the projects for, then you'll find that usually the group objectives are fairly similar. One thing that we've done in the past with a number of groups is actually, where it's been a larger number, is actually set up a working party of perhaps maybe 6 members of the overall group, all of whom will ensure that there's representation from the different schools involved in the project. What that then means is that, whether it's a primary school, a secondary school, a maintained school, an academy, everyone is represented, and when we pull together things like a specification or where you're negotiating with a potential supplier, it ensures then that everybody's views are represented. So that's one way of actually getting over that particular challenge. The next one on there is unlikely that member contract renewal dates will fall at the same time. Yeah, that's a fair shout. There will be some instances where it ideally lends itself to collaboration. So a good example of that would be a project we ran with the Oxfordshire Academies recently, where their payroll and HR admin services were potentially being migrated to the Hampshire Integrated Business Centre, and the academies decided that actually they didn't really want to necessarily do that. They wanted to explore the market and be sure that if they were going into the Hampshire IBC, it was the right thing for them to do and it was best value. So in that instance, it was great because all 33 participants in that project had the same contract renewal date, so it was really easy to manage that particular one. However, you will have examples. A good example might be waste contracts, for example, so your skips and bins, or telephony contracts, so your calls and lines. Each school may have very different renewal dates and maybe even different renewal dates within the school. The way that you can actually get over that challenge is to advise suppliers of when the contract renewal dates are and ask them to commit to the pricing that they're putting forward for your school when your contract renews. And most suppliers, as long as it's within a reasonably short period of time, will be happy to do that. So it doesn't matter if your contract renewal dates are slightly different, it will still work. The other challenge potentially is where it's harder to achieve results is if there's a wide geographic spread of members, because what that means is local or regional suppliers are effectively ruled out. A good example of this would be perhaps grounds maintenance, where a lot of organisations are fairly local. Something like occupational health services is also quite hard to do across a wide area because a lot of those services will need to be delivered fairly locally so that staff can actually reach the location where the services are being delivered. So that's a little bit harder to achieve, but some of the other areas I mentioned earlier, waste management, for example, telephony, they lend themselves beautifully, regardless of the location of where the school is. So having talked about some of the perhaps challenges around collaborative purchasing, there are obviously a lot of benefits. So one of the benefits is around volume consolidation. So it makes it possible for you to have one negotiation rather than having lots of different negotiations. And the suppliers love that because it's easier for them as well because their cost to sell is much reduced. It also, of course, increases the power of the purchasing group members, because rather than being maybe one small primary school, actually you've got a group, and the value at stake is much better. There's improved quality control as well, because obviously if you're one small school, your voice may potentially be lost with the supplier if your service suddenly starts to deteriorate. If you're a large group, then you are a loud voice, and that makes it much easier to talk to your supplier about any particular issues with regard to service. If the thought of them losing 30 customers obviously is going to grab their attention much more than the thought of losing one. Obviously there's financial benefits in relation to cost reductions, so not only in terms of the overall price that you achieve by leveraging your group spend, but also the admin costs of running it. So if you do decide to engage a consultant, for example, then the cost of that particular consultant will be shared amongst the group, which obviously makes it much more cost effective. And then very, very importantly, there's a huge time saving. Having one project saves people reinventing the wheel, saves multiple schools doing the same activities, and there's a massive benefit from that. And obviously, we all know none of us have got enough time. Just some success factors there. I think you do need to have trust amongst your group in order to be successful. As I mentioned earlier, if you've got a working party, you do need to trust that actually, they're going to make the right decisions and give the right information. In terms of the actual savings, people often say to me, well, how much am I going to save if I do this? It's a bit like how long's a piece of string. It really depends on how well your spend category is managed in the first place, when you last negotiated it, what's happened with the market since then, and a whole raft of different sort of factors. Also, it's dependent on what spend category it is. So, for example, oil is very high volume but low margin, and so the ability to negotiate that margin is more limited. In things like waste contracts, and IT contracts, that kind of thing, there's a much bigger margin, so there's more to negotiate. And I think, the overall success factor really is that if the savings from the project exceed any and all costs in the running of it, then I'd say that that's deemed to be successful. We have run some collaborative purchasing projects in the past, some Oxfordshire Academy ones, one for the Pilgrim Learning Trust, and more recently the Gloucestershire Association of School Business Managers. And just very briefly to give you a couple of figures on those in terms of the savings that were achieved, just to give you an idea of the size of the prize in terms of collaboration. The Oxfordshire Payroll and HR Admin project, there were 33 secondary and primary academies. There was a 58% saving against the proposed cost from the Hampshire Integrated Business Centre. That equated to hundreds of thousands of pounds across the contract value. So it was a massive saving and a huge result. Pilgrim Learning Trust, that was a telephony contract, 14 schools involved in that, maintained special academy, secondary and primary schools all involved, a £21,500 saving across the 14 schools, an average of 63% saving on their calls and lines. And the Gloucestershire project, which we've just completed, 23 schools, £21,000 of savings, an average of 48% saving on their calls and lines costs. So as you can see from that, there's huge benefits. I'm not going to run through these slides because I'm just conscious of time, but what I would say is do bear in mind compliance, with ODU. What I would say is you mustn't split your own contracts into smaller lots to avoid running an ODU process. But in the case of collaborative purchasing, what you can do is set it up so that each school is individually contracting with the supplier. So you're not running it as one overall contract. You're not saying that all schools have got to contract. It may be the case, and we've done this with a recent energy renewal, where some schools went with one supplier and other schools went with a different one. So if you set it up so that everyone's contracting individually, not only does that give flexibility, but it also means that you don't have to breach the ODU threshold, and you're not deliberately circumventing it. It's because you're actually contracting individually. All you need to do is just say to the suppliers, if 1 to 5 schools contract with you, what sort of discount will you give? If it's 6 to 10, what sort of discount will you give? And that's the way of actually leveraging the spend and getting your discount. So as I've just said, with collaborative procurement, does it breach the ODU threshold? It does kind of depend. It's a bit of a grey area, but in most cases, as long as you're contracting individually as a school, then it's fine. You won't be breaching the threshold. So that's it sort of for my formal part of the presentation. There is some free stuff on our website, as I mentioned earlier. There's a 7 Deadly Sins of School Procurement document that you can download, and also 84 points for a perfect procurement process. And as I mentioned earlier, there's always the option of picking the phone up and asking us for other advice. We'd be very happy to talk to you. So I hope that's helpful. Back to Mike.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. So we've had a couple of questions that have come in during the webinar. The first is, what are the easiest areas to make savings in? Lorraine.
I think the easiest areas, and probably you've gathered that from the presentation, I think telephony is a really good one where you can make some very significant savings. But the nice thing about it is it's very straightforward. You only, when you change your telephony provider, the calls and lines just switch instantly. There's no implementation involved in it, so there's no onerous sort of mobilisation to do, and you can make some savings pretty quickly. Likewise, the waste management is also another good one where there's often good savings. What's important with something like waste management, though, is to make sure that you are perhaps a bit more strategic with your review than just going for a like-for-like comparison. So, for example, sort of general mixed waste is very expensive. It attracts landfill tax, which is going up every year. So one of the things that you need to be focused on with waste management is potentially looking at how can we direct some of our waste in different ways? How could we maybe recycle more, because recycling collections are much cheaper? Can we put our food waste as part of a food waste collection, because food waste is very heavy. If it goes in the general mixed waste, it's going to attract the landfill tax, it'll be expensive. If it goes in a food waste collection, it will go to an anaerobic digestion station, and it's much cheaper to process that waste. So waste is another good one, but be strategic with it, I would say.
Okay, thanks, Lorraine. We've had another one in. With Brexit, what impact will that have on OJU requirements? I think the good news, Lorraine, is I think you know the answer to this question.
I do know the answer to this question, thank goodness. Because funnily enough, someone said to me one day, well, what's going to happen to your business with Brexit then? Because it's all around the OJU regulations, and if we're not in the European Union, there won't be any work for you. I don't think the government are going to turn around and actually suddenly abandon all rules and regulations simply because we're not in the EU. What will happen is, as with all legislation, there will be, we will adopt the existing legislation as it stands, and then eventually it will be reviewed. I think the good news about OJU procurement regulations is that they do work. And so I think what will happen is that there will be other much bigger priorities when it comes to legislation that will take the government's attention first, and eventually they will get round to looking at it. But I strongly suspect, in industry professionals are saying the likelihood is that they'll just simply tweak the existing regulations as opposed to making any wholesale changes with it.
Okay, thanks, Lorraine. So I think that's the end of the questions. So just finally there are some contact details if anyone has any questions. I suspect Lorraine may get more questions than I do on this, so I'd just like to close by thanking Lorraine very much for her input. That was, I think, very interesting, and I thank everyone on the webinar for attending. We hope that you'll join us at some later webinars, which you will receive details of in the future. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.